A pregnant woman was walking in the park in the cold of a Christmas week until she saw a scene that turned her life upside down. But before we dive into the full story, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. Now, subscribe to the channel and let's get started. The icy wind of late afternoon swept through the nearly deserted park, whispering through the leafless trees and lifting damp leaves from the ground. Mia pulled her coat tighter around her rounded belly, trying to shield herself from the biting cold that seemed to cut through the wool. Her steps were slow, weary, but she knew she needed that brief moment of fresh air before returning to her cramped, stuffy apartment. The weight of pregnancy, loneliness, and accumulating worries made the simple act of walking feel like a battle. The silence of the park, broken only by the occasional crackle of dry branches beneath her feet, was interrupted by something strange. Ahead, on the wooden bridge spanning the river, a black SUV stood parked, its lights off. Mia frowned, hesitating for a moment before continuing, her instincts warning her that something was off. Suddenly, the deep sound of a car door slamming echoed in the air. Mia froze, holding her breath. Two men stood on the bridge, their silhouettes outlined against the gray sky. One of them gestured intensely, while the other remained still, as if awaiting something inevitable. She stayed motionless, her heart racing, unsure whether to move forward or retreat. Then, it happened. The larger man stepped forward and with a brutal motion shoved the other man from behind. The sound of a body hitting the water echoed through the empty park, followed by a terrifying silence. Mia covered her mouth with her hand, muffling a scream, and instinctively crouched behind a wooden bench. Her wide eyes followed the SUV as it reversed slowly and disappeared around the curve of the path. She stayed there for what felt like endless seconds, her heart pounding so hard she could feel each beat in her ears. Logic screamed at her to run, to get away from the horror, but something inside her kept her rooted to the spot. Perhaps it was the instinct to protect the life growing within her, or a simple and dangerous curiosity. With trembling breaths, she slowly stood up and walked toward the bridge. Looking over the railing, she saw the figure in the water, struggling to stay afloat. The current was strong, and the man seemed on the brink of losing consciousness. Mia looked around, but the park remained empty. No one else was there to witness what was happening. "Oh my God," she whispered, feeling the weight of the decision she had to make. She pulled her phone from her pocket and, with trembling fingers, dialed her Uncle James's number. His calm, deep voice answered on the third ring. "Mia, is everything okay?" he asked, as direct as ever. "Uncle James, I need help. There's a man. He fell into the river. No, he was pushed. Please come quickly." Her voice was desperate, punctuated by her rapid breathing. James didn't ask questions, responding with the efficiency of someone who had been in dangerous situations before. "Stay where you are. I'm on my way. Don't do anything risky, understand?" But it was too late for that warning. Mia, sensing the panic of the man clinging to a root near the riverbank, knew he wouldn't survive much longer if she didn't act. Gripping the railing tightly, she climbed down the muddy bank, her feet slipping on the wet stones. "Hold on, I'm coming to help you," she shouted, her voice steady despite the fear consuming her. The man lifted his head with difficulty. His face was injured, a deep gash on his forehead mixing blood with the dark water streaming down his neck. He tried to speak, but the sound that emerged was weak, barely audible. Mia knelt at the edge, reaching out her hand. The man, exhausted, made one last effort, gripping her fingers with hands that felt frozen. Using all the strength she had, she pulled, feeling the mud give way beneath her feet. With a groan, the man finally emerged from the water, collapsing heavily onto the bank beside her. He coughed, spitting out water, and tried to lift his head. "Who?" he began, but Mia cut him off. "Don't speak now. You're safe. My uncle is coming, and he'll help us." The man's gaze met hers, intense and filled with something Mia couldn't discern, gratitude or despair. He tried to speak again, and this time the words came, though weakly. "It was my brother," he said before fainting in Mia's arms. She remained there, kneeling on the riverbank, the cutting wind whipping her face as she processed the words she had just heard. A wave of fear and determination enveloped her. There was no turning back now. The sound of hurried footsteps on the gravel snapped her out of it. She looked up to see James approaching with a flashlight, his worried expression growing graver as he took in the scene. "My God, Mia, what have you done?" Mia glanced at the unconscious man, then at her uncle, her heart still pounding in her chest. "I did what was right," she murmured, more to herself than to him. James sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "They could come back at any moment. We need to get out of here now." Mia nodded, her gaze falling again on the unconscious man. She knew the decision she had made in that moment would change everything. And as the distant echo of the SUV faded into the cold night, she heard her own heart whispering the only certainty she had. The danger was only beginning. James firmly supported Richard, gripping his shoulders as he guided the semi-conscious man through the dark park. Mia walked beside them, her trembling hands clutching her phone to light up the uneven path. Each step felt eternal, the cold air clinging to their skin like a warning of something darker lurking that night. "Will he make it?" Mia asked, her voice heavy with concern. "Only if we move quickly," James replied, his tone carrying the hardened calm of someone accustomed to chaos. "My house isn't far. He needs a safe place." Richard let out a low groan, trying to lift his head. His weak voice broke through the silence. "My brother tried..." The words dissolved into the air, lost in the wind. "Don't talk now," James interrupted firmly. "Save your strength." Mia watched the struggle in Richard's eyes, as if he were hanging by an invisible thread. With every step, the feeling of being watched intensified. The SUV was gone, but its presence lingered like a phantom haunting the park. She quickened her pace, instinctively cradling her belly with her hands. "James, what if they come back?" Her voice quivered. "We need to get out of here before that happens." He glanced over his shoulder, his expression grave. "But Mia, you shouldn't be here. It's not safe for you or the baby." "I couldn't leave him there," Mia insisted, her tone defiant despite feeling the weight of his words. "I just couldn't." James didn't respond, only quickened his steps. His arm remained firm around Richard, who was growing heavier, as though gravity itself was trying to pull him down. They reached a side street where the streetlights flickered irregularly. James's house was just ahead, a modest structure with peeling paint and small windows. It looked like a refuge, but Mia knew its shelter was fragile against what they were facing. "Let's get inside," James said, quickly unlocking the door. He practically carried Richard in, laying him down on the old couch in the living room. The smell of aged wood and stale coffee enveloped Mia as she stepped across the threshold. Mia locked the door carefully behind her before kneeling next to Richard. His skin was pale, and his eyes rolled as if battling exhaustion. "Water," Richard murmured, barely audible. Mia rose and fetched a mug from the small kitchen, filling it with water from the filter. She returned quickly, helping him take small sips. He coughed lightly, but seemed to gain a bit of clarity. "Who are you?" Mia asked, her voice low but tinged with curiosity and caution. "Why would someone do this to you?" Richard took a deep breath, as though trying to muster the strength to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse but firm enough to hold their attention. "My name is Richard Greaves." He paused, meeting her gaze. "I am, or was, the president of a charitable foundation. My brother. He wants me gone." Mia's eyes widened. His words felt too big for the small room. "Your brother?" James asked from his post by the window, his expression alert as he scanned the street. "Why?" Richard took another labored breath, his chest rising and falling with effort. He was embezzling money from the foundation. Millions. When I confronted him, he pushed me out, said there would be no witnesses, that I was a problem that needed to disappear. James turned slowly, his brows furrowed. "Do you have proof?" he asked. "Proof." Richard closed his eyes, struggling to focus. "I had, and still have, in my coat." Mia glanced at the wet coat lying on the floor, its pockets caked with mud. She crouched and searched quickly, pulling out a flash drive tucked into the lining. She held it up, as if it were the most fragile and precious thing in the world. "This?" she asked, showing it to Richard. He opened his eyes just enough to nod faintly. "It's part of it, but we need more." James took the flash drive from Mia's hands and examined it, his expression darkening. "This is worth a fortune to the people after you," he said, looking back at Richard. "But it's also a death sentence if they find out we have it." A chill ran down Mia's spine. She looked from James to Richard, realizing they were caught in something far bigger than she had imagined. Suddenly, Richard slumped to the side, passing out again. Mia knelt beside him, placing her hand on his sweaty forehead. "He's not well," she said, her voice trembling. "James, we need to do something." James nodded, but his face was clouded with worry. "First, we need to make sure no one followed us here." He stood and began securing the windows, blocking them with chairs and tables. Mia stayed by Richard's side, listening to the wind outside and the creak of the floorboards under James's steps. An uneasy silence settled over the room, heavy with tension. She held Richard's hand, and for a moment felt utterly powerless. She didn't know what she had gotten herself into, but one thing was clear. There was no turning back now. When James returned and sat in the armchair by the door, his expression offered no reassurance. "They know he's not dead," he said quietly, "and they could come back at any moment." Mia looked at him, fear rising in her eyes. "What now, Uncle? They could come back any second." The house seemed like an improvised shelter against an invisible storm, every sound from the outside intensifying the sense of vulnerability. James locked the front door with practiced hands, stacking a chair against it as his vigilant gaze scanned every corner of the room. Mia, seated on the floor beside the couch, watched over Richard. He slept deeply, but his pale, marked face showed he was still far from recovery. "How is he?" James asked without turning around. "Still breathing," Mia said, gently touching Richard's forehead. "But he's so hot. I think he has a fever." James muttered something inaudible, frustrated. He retrieved an old revolver from a hidden trunk beneath the bed, checked the chamber, and tucked it into his waistband. "I don't like this," he finally said, facing Mia. "Something's wrong. I feel like we're being watched." Mia swallowed hard, instinctively glancing at the window. Outside, the street was deserted, lit only by the weak, flickering glow of a street lamp swaying in the wind. Still, she couldn't shake off the oppressive feeling that someone was out there, hidden in the shadows. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I'm reinforcing everything I can here. I don't know how much time we have, but I don't want to take chances. Stay with him and let me know if anything changes." Mia nodded, though her heart tightened with worry. As James disappeared down the hallway, she focused on Richard. The sound of his unconscious murmurs drew her closer. "Funds, accounts, my brother," Richard muttered incoherent words, his mind clearly trapped in the events that had led him there. Mia wanted to shake him, to pull him back to lucidity, but she knew he needed rest. Exhaustion began to overtake her as well. Her hands trembled as she stroked her belly, as if trying to soothe the baby against the chaos surrounding her. Suddenly, a sound interrupted her thoughts. Footsteps. Light, almost imperceptible, but distinct in the night's silence. Her body tensed, and she held her breath, her eyes fixed on the window. Something moved past the glass, a shadow. "James," she called in an urgent whisper. He appeared quickly, holding a flashlight. His eyes met hers, full of alertness. "Stay here," he said, walking toward the kitchen. He turned off the light as he entered to avoid being seen. Slowly, he lifted a corner of the curtain, his body tense like a taut string. "What do you see?" Mia whispered, her voice almost failing. James ducked down, quickly closing the curtain. A car, black, parked at the corner. Panic clenched Mia's chest. "Is it the same one from before?" "I don't know," he replied, looking at the door as if it might burst open at any moment. "But I don't like it. I'm going to turn off all the lights." Mia watched as he meticulously extinguished every light in the house, leaving only a small lamp near the couch where Richard slept. The darkness swallowed the room, amplifying every sound: the wind outside, branches scraping against the windows, the muffled footsteps that now seemed to come from the yard. The phone rang suddenly, the sharp sound slicing through the silence like a blade. Mia jumped, clutching her belly. James rushed to the phone and answered quickly. "Hello? Who's there?" No response, only static. "Who's there?" he demanded, but the silence persisted before the line went dead. James slowly set the phone down, his jaw tight. Mia struggled to her feet, leaning on the armrest of the chair. "They know we're here, don't they?" Her voice barely came out, almost a whisper. "Probably," James replied, glancing at the revolver at his waist. "But we're not going to make it easy for them." Movement at the window caught both their attention. A shadow passed by again, this time slower, closer. Mia felt her heart race, and her instincts drove her to the couch. She placed her body between Richard and the window's direction, shielding him instinctively, as if he were her own. James grabbed the flashlight and pointed it toward the window, but turned it off before getting too close. "Don't move," he said softly. He crept toward the back door, where the sound of breaking branches was clearer. When he reached it, he heard the doorknob rattle faintly. "Mia, stay with Richard. Now," he ordered, his voice low but firm. Mia hurried to the couch, kneeling beside Richard. She placed her hand over his, squeezing it tightly. "Please stay quiet. Please," she murmured, more to herself than to him. The sound of footsteps outside grew louder. James pressed himself against the wall near the back door, revolver in hand. He raised a finger to his lips, signaling Mia to remain silent. A soft click echoed in the air, the back door's lock. Mia felt her blood run cold. The shadows outside were no longer a distant threat. They were there, right at the threshold, breaking the fragile barrier that separated them. James gripped the gun tightly and moved slowly, but before he could act, the sound of a distant engine broke the tension. The black car at the corner started up, its headlights sweeping across the street, before disappearing into the darkness. James let out a long breath, lowering the gun, but his face remained far from relaxed. "They're here, Mia. They're just waiting for the right moment." The pale light of dawn seeped through the cracks in the curtains, but the glow felt distant, almost irrelevant. Inside the house, the air was heavy with tension, and a nervous silence hung over everyone. Mia opened her eyes slowly, still feeling the weight of the previous night. The discomfort in her back reminded her that she had fallen asleep sitting next to Richard, her head resting on her arms crossed over the arm of the sofa. Movement upstairs indicated that James was already awake. She raised her eyes to Richard. He was still unconscious, but his breathing was more stable now. Mia adjusted the blanket that James had placed over him during the night and sighed. For a moment, she allowed herself a glimmer of hope. Maybe things would get better. James came down the stairs with firm steps, his expression more serious than usual. He carried the landline phone and set it on the table. "I called an old friend," he said. "A retired cop, trustworthy. He said he'll try to help, but he can't promise anything." "What if no one can help?" Mia asked, her voice heavy with worry. "We're alone here, James. They know where we are." James looked at her for a moment before shifting his gaze to Richard. He shook his head, picking up the wet coat that was still on the floor. "If we keep waiting, we'll only give them more chances to find us. We need to understand exactly what we're dealing with." As he spoke, Mia began rummaging through the pockets of Richard's coat, hoping to find more clues. Her fingers touched something small and rigid, a second flash drive hidden in the lining. She held it between her fingers, surprised. "James, I think this is important." She extended the flash drive to him. James took the object and examined it. His eyes narrowed, and he motioned for Mia to follow him to the small makeshift office at the back of the house. An old computer rested on a worn wooden desk, surrounded by piles of papers. "Let's see what's on this," he said, plugging the flash drive into the computer. The startup screen took its time, but when the files finally appeared, Mia held her breath. Emails, contracts, and photographs filled the screen. Some of the documents were marked with the names of local politicians and businessmen that Mia instantly recognized. It was a web of corruption so vast it made her stomach churn. "My God," she murmured. "This is bigger than I thought." James scrolled through the documents quickly, his face growing paler with each line he read. This guy was trying to expose his own brother, but he stumbled onto something much more dangerous. This involves powerful figures. If they find out we have this... He stopped, clenching his fist tightly. "We have to be careful." Suddenly the phone rang again. Mia jumped, the memory of the previous call still fresh in her mind. James stood and answered. "Hello?" Once more, only static. "Who is this?" James demanded, his voice tense. The static continued for a few seconds before the line went dead. James replaced the receiver, looking at Mia with a furrowed brow. "They want us to know they're watching." Before Mia could respond, the lights in the house flickered. For a moment, the computer shut off, then restarted, as if someone were tampering with the power. "That was strange," Mia said, glancing at James with concern. "Very strange." He walked to the window and peeked through the curtains. The black car was still there, motionless, but now it seemed more menacing than before. Mia returned to the computer and tried to print one of the most critical documents. The familiar sound of the old printer started, but when the page came out, It was completely blank. She tried again, with the same result. "James, something's wrong. I sent it to print, but nothing comes out." Her voice trembled. James turned and looked at the blank paper, taking it carefully. "Sabotage. They might have tampered with the power meter or the equipment. It's another warning." A noise from the basement made them both turn quickly. The sound of something moving down there was unmistakable. James grabbed the flashlight and the revolver. "Stay here with Richard." He walked slowly to the basement door, opening it cautiously. Mia stood frozen in the living room, her heart pounding. She wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. James disappeared into the darkness of the basement, leaving only the sound of his footsteps echoing on the stairs. Seconds later, he returned, shaking his head. "There's no one down there, but..." He paused, holding something that looked like a piece of wire. "They messed with the breaker box. They're toying with us." Mia gripped the flash drive in her hand, a growing determination in her chest. She looked at James and in a low voice murmured, "They've already started playing dirty." The day was gray and heavy, as if the very sky knew something dark was unfolding in that small house. Outside, the black car remained parked at the corner, a silent and implacable presence that sent shivers down Mia's spine every time she glanced out the window. The man in the suit, motionless under the streetlight, looked more like a shadow than a real person. He spoke on his phone, occasionally casting glances toward the house. She knew they were being watched, and the thought that the man might approach at any moment was terrifying. Mia sat in the armchair, carefully examining the flash drive. Every time she held it, she felt the weight of the responsibility it carried. It wasn't just a small device. It was the key to bringing down a massive corruption scheme and, at the same time, a target painted on her back. "This flash drive is the only thing keeping Richard alive," she muttered to herself, but her tone made her shudder. The responsibility felt overwhelming. Richard, still weak, was slumped on the couch. His breathing seemed less erratic, but he was clearly far from regaining his full strength. He watched Mia with tired but alert eyes. "Mia," he said hoarsely, struggling to speak. "On the flash drive, there are passwords and names. You have to use them. It's the only way." "Passwords? For what?" She leaned closer to hear him better. "Internal systems of the Foundation, emails, transaction records, everything my brother tried to hide." He coughed, choking slightly. "But it's risky. Very risky." Mia exchanged a glance with James, who sat at the table, frantically scribbling notes on a piece of paper. He looked determined, but exhausted. "Richard, I need you to tell me exactly what to look for," James said without looking up from his notes. "The more details, the better." Richard nodded, closing his eyes for a moment before starting to dictate numbers, email addresses, and details only he seemed to know. James wrote everything down quickly, while Mia watched out the window, her eyes fixed on the shadowy figure of the man in the suit. Outside, the wind began to lift a faint mist, partially obscuring the view of the street. It should have been comforting, but somehow it only made everything feel more sinister. "James, that man is still there. He hasn't moved even for a minute," Mia said, her voice tense. James glanced out the window and frowned. "He's waiting for reinforcements. Or maybe just the right moment," he said, standing and checking the locks again. "We need to act fast before he decides to make a move." The idea that they could be stormed at any moment made Mia clutch the flash drive against her chest. She knew it was valuable, but it also felt like it was becoming a kind of curse. "I'll go out the back," James suddenly said, grabbing his coat. "I need to find an old friend. He can help distribute this information safely." "Leave?" Mia asked, alarmed. "What if they notice? What if they follow you?" "I know a way. I'll be discreet." He looked at her firmly. "While I'm gone, lock everything and trust no one. If something happens, hide the flash drive." Before she could respond, James slipped out the back door, moving quickly and silently. The house felt even emptier without him, the silence filled only by the sound of the wind rattling the windows. Mia tried to focus on taking care of Richard, but the tension was crushing. Every sound seemed amplified: the creaking of the floorboards, the noise of footsteps coming from the yard. Or maybe it was just her imagination. She turned off the living room light, leaving only the faint glow of a candle on the table. The darkness felt like an ally now, hiding them from the eyes watching outside. But then, something changed. The backyard gate creaked, and Mia's heart stopped for a moment. Holding her breath, she extinguished the candle and hid behind an old dresser. With the flash drive gripped tightly in her hand, she watched the shadows moving through the window. A henchman appeared, his steps silent but determined. He looked through the window, trying to see inside the darkened house. Mia felt adrenaline surge through her veins, every muscle in her body tense. Outside, the henchman spoke softly into his phone. "She's here with him. I need to finish this quickly." The deep, threatening voice made Mia squeeze her eyes shut, trying to suppress any movement that might give her away. The man tried to open the window, but it didn't budge. Frustrated, he moved around, looking for another way in. Richard opened his eyes slightly, realizing what was happening. He tried to speak, but Mia urgently gestured for him to stay quiet. "Please, no," she whispered to herself. The sound of the back door handle turning made her freeze. The henchman was trying to get in. Mia's heart raced, but before he could open the door, something interrupted him. Maybe a noise from the street or some unexpected movement. The man stepped away, but Mia clearly heard his words before he disappeared into the darkness. "We need to act before Christmas." She remained motionless, every fiber of her body on high alert, until everything was silent again. Only then did she release the breath she had been holding, her hands still trembling. Clutching the flash drive tightly, Mia closed her eyes, feeling the tension in every part of her body. The danger felt imminent, and she knew she couldn't let her guard down for even a second. Amid the terrifying silence, a faint click came from the back door. She knew immediately that the noose was tightening. James entered through the door with quick steps, locking it immediately and stacking a chair against it. His breathing was ragged, his eyes darting around the room as he scanned it. Mia, seated on the sofa next to Richard, stood up with difficulty, pressing her hand against her stomach as if it could hold back the growing fear. "What is it?" she asked, her voice low, almost a whisper. "Things have escalated, Mia." James pulled a revolver from his waistband, placing it on the table with a heavy thud. It's not just his brother. This goes way beyond him. Politicians, businessmen, powerful figures in the city. They're all neck deep in this. He ran a hand through his graying hair, visibly troubled. We're dealing with a network of power, not just a jealous brother. Mia felt a chill run down her spine. She already knew it was dangerous, but hearing James's words made it all the more real. "Does that mean they won't stop?" she asked, trying to keep calm. "It means we need to be faster than they are. James replied. He glanced at Richard, who had stirred awake, though he still looked weak and disoriented. And you, Richard, need to remember everything, every detail. We need that information now. Richard tried to sit up on the sofa but groaned in pain, clutching his side. His voice came out low and strained. I'm trying. It's like a puzzle. But some pieces are coming back. Passwords, accounts. I know where my brother hid the records. But you need to act fast. James grabbed a piece of paper and a pen, leaning in close to Richard. Tell me everything you remember, no matter how small it seems. As Richard murmured information, Mia walked to the window and peeked through the curtain. The black car was still there, but now it seemed closer. She saw a silhouette step out of the vehicle, a tall, burly man wearing a hat pulled low over his face. He looked directly at the house. James, she called, trying to keep her voice steady. Someone got out of the car. He's coming this way. James stood immediately, his eyes fixed in the direction of the window. He switched off the living room light with a quick motion and picked up the revolver again. Close the curtains. Don't let them see anything. He turned to Richard. Stay quiet. Don't make a sound. Mia hurried to close all the curtains, her hands trembling as she pulled the thick fabric over the windows. She returned to the sofa, clutching the USB drive as if her life depended on it. Outside, the sound of footsteps echoed in the silence. They were deliberate, almost calculated, as if the man knew he was being heard. We can't just wait, James, Mia whispered, the urgency tightening her chest. If he comes in, what do we do? He's not coming in, James replied, though his voice lacked the confidence he intended. But if he tries, I'm ready. The footsteps stopped, and the silence that followed was even more suffocating. Suddenly, a deep, threatening voice called out from outside. We know he's in there. Hand him over, and no one else gets hurt. Mia felt her blood run cold. She looked at James, waiting for him to say something, but he just stood there, gripping the revolver tighter. We're not responding, he muttered, his tone firm. They're trying to provoke us. The voice outside continued, now more impatient. We're not playing games. Hand over the man and the material, or we're coming in. Inside, Mia felt the panic rising. The sound of flashlights sweeping across the windows made her heart race. Beams of light cut through small gaps in the curtains, momentarily illuminating the room. James, they know what we have, she said, clutching the USB drive tighter. And they won't stop until they get it. I know, he replied, his voice grave. That's why we can't let them in. The shattering of glass made them jump. A window in the kitchen had been broken, the sound slicing through the silence like an explosion. Cold wind rushed through the opening, scattering the papers on the table. James aimed the revolver in the direction of the noise, his eyes fixed on the darkness. Stay behind me, he shouted. Richard tried to rise but was still too weak to move. Mia placed a hand on his shoulder, as if her presence alone could shield him. The sound of footsteps on the wooden floor now echoed inside the house. James, Mia began, but her voice was drowned out by another sound, the front doorknob turning slowly. James pointed his gun at the door, but before he could act, the voice from outside spoke again, now even closer. This is your last chance. You know what we want. Mia looked at Richard, then at James. The tension in the air was unbearable. She knew the confrontation was inevitable, and there was no way to escape it now. Flashlights continued sweeping across the windows, but the sound of footsteps seemed to retreat momentarily, as if the men outside were reassessing the situation. James didn't lower his gun, his eyes locked on the door.
The silence returned, but no one felt relief. It was merely the calm before the storm. And then another window shattered, the sound tearing through the cold air. James spun quickly, aiming his weapon toward the noise, while Mia held the USB drive tightly, knowing it was all they had.
The danger was no longer just outside. It was inside the house now. The sound of shattering glass still echoed in the room as the first thug stepped through the window. His heavy boots crushed the shards scattered across the floor, and the icy wind rushing into the house seemed to heighten the tension. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a predatory gaze that swept the room before settling on Mia and Richard. "I found you," he said with a cruel smile, advancing with calculated steps. Mia instinctively stepped back, shielding her belly with her hands, trying to position herself between the man and Richard, who was still too weak to stand. James was across the room, shoving a cabinet against the door to block another possible entry point. "Don't take another step," James shouted, placing himself between the thug and the others. The man simply laughed, as if the attempt at intimidation were insignificant. "I don't want to hurt anyone. We just want what's on the flash drive. Hand it over, and this ends here." Mia glanced at James, her heart pounding. The flash drive was tucked into her pocket, pressing against her leg like a constant reminder of the danger. "You have no idea what you're up against, do you?" The thug continued, stepping closer. "We just need that. Don't make this harder than it has to be." James didn't reply but stepped forward firmly, blocking the way. The thug frowned, his patience waning. Before anyone could react, another sound echoed through the house. The back door burst open, slamming against the wall with a loud crash. A second man entered, smaller and more agile, his eyes gleaming with determination. He said nothing, but his expression made it clear. They weren't here to negotiate. Chaos erupted. The first thug lunged toward Mia, but James grabbed his arm with all his strength, yanking him back. The two began to struggle, overturning chairs and crashing into the table as Mia screamed. The second man darted toward the couch where Richard was. Mia stepped in front of him, arms outstretched like a shield. "No, stay away from him," she shouted, her voice trembling but resolute. "Step aside," the thug said coldly. "I don't want to hurt you." She didn't budge. He moved forward, trying to push her aside, but Mia grabbed a couch cushion and threw it at his face, disorienting him just enough to buy a moment. She seized the chance to pull Richard away, trying to distance him. James was still grappling with the first man, who was stronger but less agile. The thug managed to shove James against the wall, knocking down a picture frame. James gasped, but didn't relent, using every ounce of strength to push back. Meanwhile, the second thug broke past Mia, grabbing Richard's arm. The philanthropist tried to resist, but was too weak. The thug patted Richard's pockets, clearly searching for the flash drive, but found nothing. "Where is it?" he shouted, glaring at Mia. "I know you have it." Mia's stomach churned, but she held her ground. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, stalling for time. The man didn't believe her. He grabbed her arm with a bruising grip. Mia struggled to break free, panic surging within her, until something unexpected happened. Richard, despite his frailty, summoned what little strength he had to pull the thug back. The man stumbled, losing his balance for a moment, giving Mia the chance to slip free and dash to the other side of the room. James finally overpowered the first thug, slamming him into the table, which collapsed under the impact. He rushed to Mia and Richard, placing himself protectively in front of them once more. "You'll never win," James shouted, his voice filled with rage. "No matter what you do, the truth will come out." The The thugs exchanged glances, reassessing the situation. The first man, still recovering from the fight, looked furious, but the second one smirked, as though he knew something they didn't. "Maybe you've won today," the smaller thug said, adjusting his hat as he made his way to the window. "But this is far from over." Before leaving, he leaned in close to Mia, his gaze icy and calculating. "Enjoy the time you have left. It's running out." And with that, they disappeared into the cold night like shadows, leaving the house in eerie silence. Mia collapsed to the floor, her legs trembling and her heart racing. James knelt beside her, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. She nodded, though tears were already streaming down her face. "The flash drive," she murmured, pulling it from her pocket. They almost got it. Richard, still struggling to catch his breath, looked at them with an expression of exhaustion mixed with gratitude. "You saved more than my life today," he said weakly. But the moment was interrupted by a sudden sharp pain in Mia's abdomen. She doubled over, clutching her belly tightly, her face contorted in agony. "Mia?" James gripped her shoulders, alarmed. "What's happening?" Mia was sitting on the living room floor, her eyes fixed on the flash drive in her hands. Tears still streamed down her face, and her chest rose and fell irregularly as she struggled to regain control. The pain in her stomach had subsided, but the fear lingered. James stood beside her, his gaze locked on the door, as if expecting something worse to happen. "We can't give up now," James said, breaking the silence, his voice firm but tired. "This flash drive, this information is all we have to put an end to this." Mia looked at him, wiping her tears with the sleeve of her jacket. Her expression was somber, but a spark of determination began to ignite. She knew he was right, but doubts still tormented her. "What if it's too late?" she murmured, clutching the flash drive as if sheer willpower could protect it. "They're always ahead of us. They know where we are, what we have. How can we win this?" Before James could respond, Richard groaned from the couch. He was awake, but appeared even more frail than before. His voice came out as a hoarse whisper. "There's another way. Something I did. Before all of this started." Mia and James moved closer, hanging onto his words. "What?" James asked. "What are you talking about?" Richard took a deep breath, as if gathering the strength to speak was a battle in itself. I saved copies of the evidence, not just on the flash drive." He closed his eyes for a moment before continuing. "I made a backup on James's phone." The two exchanged surprised looks. James immediately pulled his phone from his pocket and began frantically searching through the files, hope growing as he sifted through the data. "Here it is," he exclaimed at last. "Reports, emails, transactions. It's all here." Mia's heart began to race, but this time for a different reason. For the first time in days, it felt like they had a real chance. "Then we still have a shot?" she asked, trying to stand. James helped her up, and she continued. "What do we do now? We need to expose this." "Yes, but carefully," James said, glancing at the phone and then out the window, where snow was starting to fall. "We can't rely solely on the police. We need to make this public. Journalists, social media, get it all out at once." Richard nodded, his voice slightly stronger now. "They can't silence everyone at once. If we can get this to the right people, it'll be impossible to cover up." Mia felt a wave of determination wash over her. Despite the exhaustion, she knew she couldn't stop. This wasn't just about Richard or the fraud. It was about protecting her baby, her future, and the future of the people who depended on the foundation Richard had worked so hard to preserve. "Let's start now," she said decisively, "before they try to stop us again." James began configuring the phone, checking the signal, while Mia organized the digital documents. Richard, despite his weakness, pointed out the most critical files and details that would be key to the exposé. Outside, the snow was falling harder, blanketing the yard and streets in white. It was almost beautiful, if not for the tension that filled every moment inside the house. When they were finally ready, James looked at Mia and Richard. "I'll send this to every journalist I know. If someone publishes it, we have a chance." He began drafting a message, attaching the documents. The connection was unstable, but he kept pressing send, trying over and over. "Is it going through?" Mia asked nervously. "Not yet. The snowstorm is making the signal worse." James looked at the phone, frustrated. "We'll need another plan." Richard took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on James. "I can speak. Go live," he said, struggling to sit up despite the pain. "They need to hear the truth from me." Mia hesitated, looking at him with concern. "Are you sure?" she asked. "They'll know you're alive. They'll come after you even harder. They already know." Richard looked at her, his eyes tired but resolute. "If we don't do this now, everything will have been for nothing." James set up the phone's camera, improvising a stand with books and boxes. Mia turned on a small lamp to illuminate Richard as he prepared. Despite his frailty, there was something powerful in his demeanor, as if he had found renewed strength. When the broadcast began, Richard spoke directly to the camera, his voice stronger than anyone had expected. "My name is Richard Greaves. I was attacked and nearly killed for trying to expose the truth. What you're about to see are evidence of a corruption network that affects our city, our foundation, and the people who need it most." He paused, taking a deep breath. "My own brother is at the center of this, but he's not alone. Politicians, business leaders, they're all involved." Mia watched in silence, a mix of pride and fear coursing through her. Notifications began to pop up on James's phone. People were watching, sharing, reacting. "It's working," James said, surprised. "The views are going up." Richard continued, detailing the crimes and naming those involved, while James sent messages to more journalists and authorities. Outside, the snowstorm raged on, obscuring the street. But for the first time, it didn't seem to matter. When Richard finished, he looked directly into the camera, his gaze steady and firm. "The truth cannot be silenced. It's time to face this together, not for me, but for everyone who depends on justice." The broadcast ended, but the impact had already been made. Mia turned to James, who wiped sweat from his brow. "That was risky, but it's what we needed," he said, looking at Richard, now slumped on the couch, exhausted but relieved. "Now we wait and see what happens." As the wind howled outside and notifications continued to flood James's phone, Mia placed her hand on her belly and murmured to herself, "We're doing this for our future." She looked up at James and Richard and said, "It's time. Let's tell the world everything." The room was steeped in a tense silence, broken only by the muffled sound of the wind outside and the faint chime of notifications on James's phone. He sat at the table, his brow furrowed as he read the frantic responses flooding in. Journalists, curious onlookers, and even ordinary people who had watched Richard's broadcast were sharing the information, sparking a wave of attention none of them had anticipated. "This is working," James said, looking up from his phone. Some reporters are already asking how they can verify the documents. Richard, seated on the couch with a blanket draped over his shoulders, seemed more lucid than he had been in days. Although his voice was still hoarse, it carried a firmness that hadn't been there before. "We need to keep them engaged," Richard said. "They're our best protection right now. The more eyes on this, the harder it'll be for my brother to cover it up." Mia, leaning against the fireplace, absent-mindedly stroked her belly. Her gaze shifted between the window and James's phone, a battle of fear and hope waging inside her. "What about the police?" she asked cautiously. "Have they responded?" James nodded slowly. "Yes, they said they're mobilizing teams, but—" He hesitated, his tone heavy with doubt. "I'm not sure we can fully trust them. Your brother still has a lot of influence there, Richard." Richard closed his eyes briefly, pinching the bridge of his nose as if trying to ward off the persistent headache. "They'll have to act. With the media involved, they can't ignore this for long." Suddenly, a specific notification sound drew James's attention. He picked up the phone and read the message, his eyes widening slightly. "It's a journalist from the local TV station. He wants to do a live piece and says he's already at the police station with some of the documents we sent." "That's good, isn't it?" Mia asked, clinging to the possibility of a positive outcome. "It's excellent," James replied, though his tone carried a trace of concern. "But it also means your brother's cornered, Richard, and the more desperate he gets, the more dangerous he'll become." A chill ran down Mia's spine, but before she could respond, the sound of sirens echoed in the distance. Blue lights flickered against the window, and she walked over, pulling the curtain aside slightly to peek outside. "James," she began, her tone uncertain. "Is that them? The police?" James joined her at the window, peering over her shoulder. He observed for a few moments before his shoulders relaxed. "Yes, looks like they're patrolling the area. Maybe they're trying to prevent another attack," he said, glancing at Mia. "That's a good sign. It could mean they're taking this seriously." But Mia wasn't convinced. Something about the way the police cars passed without stopping left her uneasy, as if they were moving in response to something bigger, something she couldn't yet grasp. Richard coughed lightly, drawing their attention. "If they're really going after my brother, we'll hear about it soon. He's not the type to take losing lying down." James nodded, but before he could speak, the phone rang. He quickly answered with a curt, "Hello," and Mia watched him closely, trying to decipher the conversation from his tone. "Understood. Thanks for letting me know." James hung up and turned to them. "The police are heading to your brother's mansion, Richard. It seems they have enough for a search warrant." Richard let out a long sigh, as if part of the weight on his shoulders had been lifted. "Finally," he murmured, though his eyes still held a shadow of worry. Mia moved closer to the fireplace, the warmth offering some comfort as she watched the flames dance. The baby stirred, and she placed a hand on her belly, a small but genuine smile appearing on her lips. "Maybe this will all be over by Christmas," she said, more to herself than to the others. James, however, remained cautious. "It's not over yet. Until he's in custody and all the evidence is out in the open, we can't let our guard down." Another flurry of notifications drew their attention. James picked up the phone and read aloud. "A journalist confirmed the police are already at the mansion. They're going in now." Richard leaned forward on the couch, straining to hear. "Did they mention anything about his men?" "Not yet. But if they're there, they'll do everything they can to protect him and the evidence." Silence fell over the group again, the sound of the wind outside growing louder. Mia couldn't shake the feeling that something was still looming, something unpredictable. Richard broke the silence, his voice steady with resolve. They need to find the documents. Even if they capture my brother, without the right evidence, he'll get away. James nodded. That's why we sent the backups. Now we just have to hope the authorities do their job. Outside, the snowstorm grew fiercer, blanketing everything in a white shroud that obscured the view of the street. But inside the house, a flicker of hope burned, a sense that perhaps, just perhaps, the end of this battle was in sight. Mia gazed at the fireplace, watching the flames reflect off the window glass. The warmth was soothing, but her mind remained restless. Despite the good news, she knew the danger was still out there, lurking, waiting for the right moment. James wiped the sweat from his brow, looking at Richard and Mia. All we need to do now is hold on a little longer. They'll get him tonight, but we have to make sure we stay safe until then. Snow fell softly outside, blanketing everything in an immaculate white mantle. Inside the house, the tension was finally starting to dissipate. The fireplace bathed the room in a comforting warmth, and the sound of the news on TV filled the space, a reminder that their fight hadn't been in vain. Mia sat in the armchair near the window, her hands resting on her belly. She felt the baby move again, a firm motion that made her smile despite everything they had endured. James was beside her, his gaze fixed on the television. The screen showed Richard's brother's mansion being raided by the police, flashing sirens, and suited men being led out, some in handcuffs. "It's over," James said, breaking the silence. "They got him." Richard, leaning back on the sofa, exhaled deeply, a mix of relief and exhaustion washing over him. His eyes were glued to the TV, as if he needed to see every detail to believe it was real. After everything, it's finally over. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but laden with emotion. The reporter on TV continued describing the scene. Documents being carried out of the mansion, computers confiscated, and Richard's brother being escorted to a police car, his face devoid of the usual arrogance. It was a sight that had once seemed impossible. "Did they say anything about the evidence?" Mia asked, glancing at James. James shook his head. "Not yet. But with everything we sent them, they have enough to dismantle the entire operation. There's no way out for him." Mia turned back to the TV, the flames from the fireplace reflecting in her eyes. She knew this didn't erase everything they had been through, but it was the beginning of a new chapter, one where fear would no longer be a constant presence. Richard leaned forward slightly, using the makeshift cane James had given him for support. "You saved my life, and so much more than that," he said, looking at Mia and James, his expression full of gratitude. "I couldn't have done it alone." "You played your part," Mia replied, smiling softly. "Your courage made this possible." James chuckled quietly, crossing his arms. "And a little of our stubbornness. We weren't going to let you get through this without a fight." Richard smiled, a tired but genuine smile. He looked at Mia, who was still caressing her belly. "I think we owe her the most thanks. I don't know how you managed to go through all this, carrying a life inside you." Mia shrugged, her smile widening. "I think the baby is why I managed. I couldn't let them be born into a world where people like your brother win." Outside, the wind calmed, and the silence of Christmas Eve felt almost magical. James got up and went to the kitchen, returning with 3 steaming mugs of tea. He handed one to each of them, then sat beside Mia, "A toast," he said, raising his mug, "to courage, to truth, and to the future." They clinked their mugs in silence, each lost in their thoughts, but united by something deeper than words. The TV continued broadcasting the news, but it was now just background noise. What mattered was here, in the small living room, where the warmth of the fireplace and their companionship marked a victory. Richard leaned to the side and pulled something from his pocket, a small package wrapped in colorful paper with a simple bow. He handed it to Mia, smiling. "It's not much, but I think you'll like it." Mia looked at him, surprised, before taking the gift. She unwrapped it slowly, revealing a pair of tiny white baby shoes. Her eyes immediately filled with tears, and she covered her mouth with her hand. "Richard," she began, her voice breaking. "It's just a small thank you," he said, "for everything you've done, and for what you represent, hope." Mia held the baby shoes carefully, feeling the symbolic weight of the gesture. She smiled through her tears and placed the gift in her lap, looking at Richard and James. "This will be a Christmas we'll never forget," she said, her voice soft but full of emotion, "because it marks a new beginning." James nodded, raising his mug again. "A new beginning for all of us." The clock on the wall struck midnight, marking the official start of Christmas. Outside, the snow continued to fall gently, covering the world with a promise of renewal. Inside the house, the warmth of the fireplace and the bond of courage and unity were all they needed. Mia looked at James and Richard, breaking the silence one last time. "Our Christmas marks a new beginning, and a life filled with hope."